Hello and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sam Gerber, and thank you for joining Twin Capital hosted virtual tour of Liberty Pulse Spirits Whiskey Distillery. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. For those of you in Pittsburgh, Western Pennsylvania, or anywhere in the Northeast, I hope you're staying warm and inside with the nearly foot of snow we got in the past 24 hours. I enjoyed yesterday getting to spend some time and play in the snow with my daughters for their first time playing in the snow, but happy to be warm and inside today. Among the many challenges we've all faced in 2020, getting to spend time with our clients, partners, and really our friends has been one of the toughest aspects, especially this time of year where we'd normally be sharing a laugh or a drink with some great company at a holiday party. So we thought here at Twin, what could we do to take a break during the holidays, sit back, and have a little bit of a fun together? So before I turn it over to Master Distiller Kevin Huff, let me just make a couple housekeeping notes. Kevin will start out with a history of the Whiskey Rebellion here in Western Pennsylvania, and then go through a tour from grain to glass. We'll be doing a live Q&A throughout the entire tour. So whether you're the type of person that's on the college tour and you're the parent and you're standing right next to the guide, asking 100 questions, embarrassing your kid, or you're too shy to ask a question, we want to hear from all of you. So please, at any point, use the Q&A feature down here and pop in a question. Kevin and I will see it and we can address it live during the tour. We also will have a time for Q&A at the end. So if something pops in your head and you don't ask it in time, just hold on to it and we'll be able to address it at the end. Everyone who knows us at Twin has come to realize that we're big on education. While today's education is 100% non-investment related, I will just give a quick plug that here at Twin this month, we launched a new ESG strategy. If you'd like any more information about it, please reach out to us at any time. We'll have much more to say about in early 2021, but feel free over the holidays, if you're catching up on things, we'll be around and happy to talk about it. Or as always, feel free to reach out to us with anything market related. And one last thing before we get on with today's festivities, I say this on behalf of the entire team here at Twin Capital. We genuinely appreciate the opportunity to work with you and your investment programs. We know that we wouldn't exist if it weren't for you, and we don't take that for granted. So I'll raise my glass that I have with me here today to toast all of you and wish you and your families a happy and healthy holiday season, followed by a prosperous 2021. Hear, hear. So without further ado, Kevin Huff is an owner and distiller at Liberty Pulse Spirits based in Washington, PA, which he helped found in 2016. Kevin, thank you so much for being here with us today and showing us the tour. I'll let you take it away. Oh, sorry, Kevin. Have you on mute there. Apologize about that.
How's this? Can you hear me now?
That's great. It wouldn't be a Zoom virtual tour if we didn't have a quick technical difficulties, but we're good now.
All right, good. Well, hey, Sam, thank you very much. Thank you to the entire team at Twin. We appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think this will be hopefully something a little bit different, in terms of Zoom calls. Hopefully this can be a little bit lighthearted and fun, and hopefully a little bit entertaining and educational at the same time. So what we'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the history. We'll go through, I'll show you how we make all of our whiskey. Like Sam said, I love a very informative and very question-based tour. So as we go through this, Sam will help moderate. And if any questions come up, let us know. And Sam's more than welcome to interrupt me and we'll get through this together. I do have a glass of whiskey with me. Hopefully you guys do as well. We bottled a single barrel peated bourbon today that I've been busy packing up all morning and finally getting us, a chance to sit down and sip and enjoy it. So hopefully this will help get through the tour as well. So first things first is we'll step back in time. So our brand, we're a very whiskey-centric brand. We're focused on whiskey. We're a family of whiskey lovers. But like Sam said, we're in the heart of the whiskey rebellion, so it very much ties into play. So we try to do one thing as well as we possibly can, and whiskey is that. And so our story begins, or at least our brand story begins in the early 1790s. And so if you lived here in Western Pennsylvania and Washington in particular, this was essentially the frontier, right? It was about as far west as the nation had settled at the time. This is just post, right after the Revolutionary War. And so the folks living here in Western Pennsylvania had a very frontier style lifestyle. They'd raise their own food, they grow their own grain, and then they were on a largely barter-based economy. And so they would typically, barter with goods, and they would trade goods and services, and that's how they did most of their business. And so whiskey, what they figured out was really a great value, that you could get a lot more money or a lot more value by turning your grain into whiskey. So it became very common on stills very similar to the one behind me, to make whiskey on out of your grain and then trade with it. I've seen deeds of houses, bought and sold with barrels of whiskey. And so we always joke it'd be nice to be able to buy houses these days with barrels of whiskey. And that's how they did it. And so whiskey was very common. Kids would drink it. You hear it throughout history, but it was often safer than water to drink. And so throughout history, you would see people, drinking whiskey instead of the water, and kids, especially, people would drink whiskey. And so nonetheless, whiskey was a huge part of these guys' lifestyle. And what ends up happening and what leads to the whiskey rebellion was this so-called hated whiskey excise tax. And so in 1791, Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of Treasury at the time, decided that in order to help pay off Revolutionary War debts, he decided to tax whiskey. That was not a very popular tax. And so a lot of the folks that settled out here were, kind of adventurous at heart. A lot of them fled, Scotland and Ireland because of the high taxation of the British monarchy. And they fought in this Revolutionary War to not pay high taxes. And so when Hamilton decides to tax their whiskey, it was not a very popular tax. And so this is what ended up sparking the quote unquote whiskey rebellion. And very few people paid it. It was not common here in Western Pennsylvania to pay your excise tax. And what you typically do would hang a flag outside of your house called a Liberty Pole. And so our brand is called Liberty Pole Spirits, and it's kind of a tribute to the farmers of the whiskey rebellion. On our bottles, we have who we call Spirited Jane, and we'll talk more about her, but she is holding what is known as a Liberty Pole. And they would come in all shapes and sizes. They would be multiple different shapes, but they would essentially be this symbol of, hey, we hate the excise tax and we're not going to pay this excise tax. And so you had tarring and feathering of tax collectors, which was pretty serious. That likely would have, killed the excise tax collector, and would have been not pleasant. There's always a Whiskey Rebellion Festival here in Washington, which is a great time. This is a side note. Modern day times, there's this celebration. And the reason I bring it up is because a couple years ago, I was actually tarred and feathered as a whiskey excise tax, collector, sort of as an actor. And so the feathering, the tarring, and feathering rope is actually hanging in our tasting room right now. So that was a nice piece of history of what used to, was supposed to be pretty serious. So anyways, you had the tarring and feathering of tax collectors. You had the head excise tax collector's home burned to the ground. So that was a guy named John Neville. Of anybody here in Western Pennsylvania, Neville Island is named after General John Neville. And so as the head excise tax collector, when he served up a writ of arrest to a family over in South Park, they were not very happy about it. And next thing you know, shots were fired. The home gets burned to the ground, and we now have an issue, right? So George Washington, who's the sitting president, goes, hey, this group of farmers in Western Pennsylvania, have not paid their excise tax. They just tarred and feathered a bunch of tax collectors. They burned down General John Neville's home. This is now an issue. And Washington's going, okay, well, you know what? This is kind of the first test of our federal government. What do you do when your citizens decide not to pay their excise tax, and how do you handle that? And so Washington decides, hey, you know what? We have authority. In the end of the day, you should be paying your excise tax. And And so he sent a large army here to Western Pennsylvania to arrest the Whiskey Rebels. He sent out 13,000 troops from Philadelphia at the time, is where the capital was, to Western Pennsylvania, which was massive. That was bigger than any force in the entire Revolutionary War. It wasn't just like he sent a few militia, men out here to arrest the Whiskey Rebels. It was an entire army. And so this was a big deal. Very anticlimactic end to the story, though. Whenever most people fled, it was hard to conceal a 13,000 troop army coming out to Western Pennsylvania. And so a lot of people who were already on the frontier decided to go further into the frontier, Ohio and West Virginia, Kentucky, and they began distilling out in Kentucky and Ohio. And so one of the things that we're very proud of is current day Kentucky, and rightfully so, they own this kind of bourbon market, and they make a lot of good bourbon in Kentucky. But Western Pennsylvania is arguably the home of American whiskey. And so the folks back then were making rye whiskey, and taste have changed throughout history, and bourbon has certainly been a popular spirit. But as you'll start seeing, and as you have seen on state store shelves and liquor stores, is that rye whiskey is making a big comeback. So for all the Pennsylvania distilleries, including ourselves, it's an exciting time right now as more and more people are starting to go towards the more traditional, or at least a little bit older, rye whiskey. And so what you'll see, and what I'll start to do actually, is I'll kind of walk through the distillery. And so I'm going to switch on to here. I'm going to go forward, and you know what? We'll actually come back to that. We have a few customers in the distillery right now, so Sam, we'll come back to the front of the tasting room. So, but what is exciting is to actually come back and see the main distillery here. So, what I will do right now is I will set this down, and I do want to have a quiz question, just because I want to see what the audience is, what their baseline is. And so, the first thing we're going to talk about is how we make whiskey. So the big question is, what is the predominant grain in a bourbon? And so this will be a real-time question. Submit your answers right now. Let's see, Sam, are they coming in?
They're coming in. It's pretty even race so far.
Nice. What are we seeing so far?
I'll close it in a second here, but I don't want to give it away because I don't want to skew the answers that haven't come in yet.
All right, good.
All right, we'll end this.
Beautiful. All right, so the corn was the popular answer, and that is the correct answer. But the beauty is all of those could or typically are in bourbon. So what I will do, wait a second. I guess it's just on my screen. There we go. Am I back on, Sam?
Yep, you're good.
All right, perfect. So you guys were right. The predominant grain in a bourbon is corn. And so by law, it has to be at least 51% corn, whereas a rye whiskey has to be at least 51% rye. And that is your big difference in terms of what makes up a spirit, and then where it is made at is the other thing. So for bourbons, it's a strictly U.S. based spirit. A lot of people do think it has to be made in Kentucky, and a lot of it is, like we were saying. But then it can be made anywhere in the United States. You can't make a bourbon in Canada or Mexico or Scotland, but as long as it's made in the United States with at least 51% corn. That is, those are the two big things as to what make up the bourbon, and vice versa. Rye whiskey, to be a rye whiskey, you got to be at least 51% rye. And so it's very comparable to if you're eating breads, right? If you're at home and you're having some cornbread and you're eating rye bread, those two will be very, very different in flavors. And the same thing happens with our whiskey. And so all whiskey, all grain-based spirits start with these raw grains, and we grind them up in-house. We run a 600-gallon operation here. So we'll typically take 1,100 pounds of grain, 550 gallons of water, and you'll actually see, this is my brother. Everyone say hello to my brother Rob, he's making a spirit cut today. Yep. So right behind him is what's called our mash tun. So we take that 1,100 pounds of grain and water and we cook it. And so it's very much like making oatmeal. And we take all of this grain and water and we start cooking it. We hit different temperature points. But what we're doing, and the reason for doing that is extracting the sugars. So we want to pull out all of the nice grain sugars that are in those raw grains and extract them into this liquid. So by the end of that cooking process, it's a very sweet and tasty liquid. And so from there, after it's done in the mash tun, we'll pump it into one of these 3 tall fermentation vessels. So get my weatherman style here. These 2 tall pieces are fermenters. And all we do there is we put yeast in it. And so we let the yeast do all the work. The yeast love eating grain sugars. And alcohol yeast, they take and they eat this grain sugar and they spit out, for lack of a better term, they spit out alcohol. And so over the course of 6 days, this alcohol yeast is in these nice fermenters, mingling about, eating the grain sugar, spitting out alcohol, converting this raw grain sugar sweet liquid into a nice alcohol, basically a beer at that point, right? So this side of things is very similar to a beer brewery, except we don't have hops in it. It won't taste like a traditional beer, but for all intents and purposes, that first half of things is beer making. From there, and my favorite part, it goes into this nice tall still. And so this is our crown jewel of the operation. It's named Harold. So the unwritten rule of stills is that you have to name them. And so our still is named Harold. It's actually my grandfather. So my dad's dad used to direct barges on the Monongahela River, and he used to always say collect whiskey. He used to receive whiskey as gifts, but he was actually, ironically, not a very big whiskey drinker. And so when he had passed, he had all this whiskey that he had saved up throughout his life that he had never drank. And so we said that Harold, this is very fitting, Harold the still will also collect all of this whiskey throughout his life, but never drink any of it too. And it just felt like the perfect tribute to my grandfather. And so Harold the still is now making some great whiskey for us. And we're super proud of this guy. What you'll notice about the still is it's what's called a pot still. And so one of the cool things that we like to talk about here at Liberty Pole is there's kind of a difference between pot still, batch distillation, and big tall column stills. And so a lot of times in Kentucky, you will see these big tall column stills that have all these rectification plates. They're very efficient, and they can separate the alcohol from the beer very, very efficiently and economically. Whereas a lot of times in Scotland and Ireland, you still to this day see these pot stills, and they're very primitive technology. There's not a lot of bells and whistles, very few gauges and monitors. The only thing that this is a giant pot, right? That you would, essentially something that you'd put onto your stove to cook pasta in, right? And so the stainless part, the bottom of the pot, is the quote unquote pot, and we put this beer, this alcohol, into the base of it and then boil it. And all that happens on the pot still is you boil this beer, and the alcohol likes to evaporate at a faster rate than water does. And so you'll take this 8% beer, and all the vapors that are boiling off of it will turn to about 30% alcohol. And so what will end up happening is, as that distillate, as that steam, higher proof alcohol is distilling off, we collect it. And so it channels up through the copper head. You'll see it go across this nice horizontal copper line arm. And then it'll go down into the condensing arm where it'll start to cool. And then at that point, we just collect it. And that is as simple as distillation is. People have been doing this for centuries, obviously with the Whiskey Rebellion. It is essentially boiling this fermented grain-based alcohol and collecting the higher proof spirits that come off of it. So at Liberty
Kevin, we got a quick question maybe?
Yeah,
maybe
perfect.
Now would be a good time to ask it.
Yeah.
So if there are so many similarities in ingredients between whiskey and beer, how come most distillers don't make beer as well?
That's a great question. You know what? So what'll end up happening is that step between both what you drink, what we would drink if this was our beer here, and what then is distilled and eventually forms a whiskey, they taste a lot different. And so, the grains and the processes are very similar, but because we'll typically use corn and rye and wheat, and a lot of brewers will use almost all barley, they will taste quite a bit different. And without the hop step in our process, it will taste, at least in our beer step, it'll taste a lot different. And so generally, my opinion, at least in the way we would do it, and I think a lot of people would, also agree, is that while it's very similar in step, the little details that kind of define, what you want to make as a particular distillery or brewery will be a lot different. And so to focus on one, I think is, at least in our opinion, the way to make a better product. But there's certainly several ways to do it. There are a few distilleries that also have breweries attached to it. But yeah, I would say taste is the big thing. There would also be separate licensing too. So technically you can't sell a beer out of our distillery license, and you would have to have separate licenses, separate areas, separate tanks, and all that stuff. So there's probably a cost aspect to that as well, and space aspect as to why you don't see more distilleries and breweries crossing over.
And then a couple others that came in. Where did you get your pot still, and why is the top copper?
Great question. That's an awesome question. So this one actually came from Vancouver, Canada. So our first still, this is our second still. Our first still was up in outside of Bangor, Maine, and so then when we outgrew that, we went to this company called Specific Mechanical. So both make great equipment and do a really good job. It's all hand hammered copper, and so very, very detailed craftsmanship in both stills. And then the copper is actually really, really critical. That's a great question. So copper, a lot of times you see it on moonshine stills. People make stills out of copper because it's malleable and you can shape copper very, very easily. And that's how they used to be made as well too. Turns out though, copper is actually critical to taste. So it acts as a filter. When grain is being fermented in our fermenters, the yeast, in addition to making alcohol, will also give off sulfur. And so sulfur, when you distill it, becomes very, very heavily concentrated. And so as this now sulfurous distillate is steaming through the copper head, you will actually react, the sulfur will react with these, the copper will react with the sulfur. A chemical reaction occurs and sulfur is pulled out of the distillate as it channels through this copper. And so generally what you'll see is either stills will be made entirely from copper, or in our case, anything that liquid touches, we have stainless. Anything that vapor touches, we have copper. Stainless is great. It's easy to clean. It keeps things super, super sanitary. And then anything that the vapor is passing through, we have as copper in order to filter out some of the sulfur compounds. So without it, your whiskey would taste like rotten eggs, and it would not be a very desirable spirit. So yep, as long as you see copper in stills, that's your first good sign that they're doing something right.
Great. And then how often and who cleans the equipment?
Great question. My brother actually just left. He has been he generally cleans, does most of the cleaning. And actually when we got the new system, a lot of it is now pump driven. We have what we call a clean in place pump, and we'll put the heavy chemicals into the fermenters, and it's more hose moving and cycling in time. But Rob, to his credit, my brother used to, in the old 300-gallon system, he used to get in each tank every day and scrub it by hand. So occasionally I'll jump in, but he is generally our cleaning guy. So he's got the toughest job.
And then a very important question: what's in your mason jar there?
You know what? It is water right now. The color glasses here, and I'll talk a little bit about it. There's some methanol compounds that we separate. We used to store them in the clear mason jars, and so you sip enough of high proof methanol that you decide to start getting the green and blue mason jars. So this is water. I left my whiskey somewhere back on the beginning of the tour, so I'll grab that and I'll have something. yeah. Great question though.
Thanks. And I think one last one for now, and really appreciate all the questions, everyone. How long do you cook the mash?
Yeah, great question. So in the mash tun, it cooks for about 3.5 hours. And so we'll hit a couple different temperature points. Like corn, you have to cook hot. So corn, you have to cook. We'll take it to about boiling 208 degrees here and cook it for about an hour. And doing that, all the sugars are encompassed by proteins. And so they're really tightly packed in there. And so you need a lot of energy, a lot of heat to break down those starches and free them from the protein. So it takes about 3.5 hours after all of the cooking. And then it's about 6 days in the fermenter. So we'll ferment for the 6 days. It takes about a whole day to distill it. So each pass is about a day. And so we'll generally, we do the 2 passes. So you're about a week and a half from grain to what eventually will go into a barrel. And that's where we go to next. But those are the general timelines.
Cool. I think that was all the questions we had for now.
Beautiful. Well, I'll wrap up real quick in the distillery, and then we'll go back to we'll go down to the basement. So what is about to happen actually on the still? Probably within 5 minutes, Rob will come back and he's going to make what's called a cut. And so it's a very hands-on process here. Alcohol, when it's being fermented by the yeast, the yeast will create a range of flavors. Some are good, some are bad. And so what we'll put into barrels and what will eventually become into bottles, we want to be the good flavors. And so as the still is running on the second distillation, it'll go essentially bad flavors, good flavors, bad flavors. And so the beginning of the run, Rob will take and we'll separate out. Those are called the heads. What has been running and what's going to run for the next 5 minutes or so is what's called the hearts. That's the good stuff. And then the final portion will be what's called the tails. And so what Rob's doing right now is he's smelling it coming off of the still, and he's looking for some of these, what we call tailsy compounds, tailsy molecules, generally heavier oils. They start to taste a little bit musty, smell a little bit musty, and too much can be a bad thing. But some of those longer chain molecules and oils can balance your whiskey and react, in wood and with oxygen over the 2 years that we age them for. And so it's this balance of finding the right balance of flavors. And so towards the end here, especially, we'll be back here smelling and tasting as we go until, like a chef, you find this right balance of flavors in your heart's cut. And that eventually then sits in barrels and ages out for a couple of years and becomes what we like to drink as whiskey. So now, if there are no more questions, I'll take you down and show you the whiskey barrels. What is pretty cool about our building, this is an old monument factory. And so I'll kind of zoom up a little bit and try not to shake too much. But this crane that you see behind me, this is all original. And so they used to make granite headstones and statues in this building. And so this crane is all original. 1905 is when it was built. And so we couldn't operate without the crane. It is quite a useful piece to us. We move it side by hand still, and we love having it here. So now to some of my favorite parts. What I'll do is I'll flip the camera around. We're going to go downstairs to where we're aging most of our whiskey at. We just recently acquired an offsite barrel facility, and so we have some offsite barrel storage. But what you'll see as we come into the basement here is some finished product, but then we have all of our whiskey barrels sitting, along in racks. We have racks over here. We have barrels as far back as you can see, and same with the other side. We got barrels stored up in here. So what I will do is I'll talk real briefly. Let me set this down so I stop moving so much. Oops, not that. Let's go to reverse here. Perfect. I'll set up my tripod. So, oops, there we go. Oops. And one more thing here. All right, so arguably the most important part, or one of the most important parts, is the barrel maturation. And so the barrels, the whiskey sitting inside of the barrels, a lot changes. People will argue that 70% of the whiskey's flavor comes from what happens to it sitting in the barrel. And essentially all these barrels are giant tea bags. And so this is a stave, one of the sides of the barrels. You always hear people talking about, and very, very cool is the charring. And so the inside, you can see it's burnt to a crisp. It looks like it has been on fire. It's been burnt. That is the process known as charring. And so you start breaking down the wood sugars. Before the cooper does that, the guy that makes the barrels, the companies that make the barrels, they toast it. And so very similar to marshmallow roasting. The cooper will take and they will toast the barrel. They will heat it up and start to brown it. And you start to break down the wood sugars. And that's very, very impactful on the flavor. If you toast something very, very heavily, like onions, they will taste very, very different than if you just lightly toast them and just hit them onto the pan. And so same thing happens with the barrel. And so we'll specify certain toast ranges and certain char ranges that we think fit our spirits best. And then we put this distillate inside of the barrel. And what you'll see as I come up onto here, my favorite part is this line. And so this is the absorption line. This is how far that whiskey will soak into the barrel. And you can see it's quite a bit lighter on the inside than it is on the outside. And so all of that flavor, or a lot of that flavor, all of the color is given to the whiskey from soaking in and out of that wood over the over the seasons, over the years. And so really, really critical. And because of that, you can only use the barrel one time for an American bourbon and rye whiskey. And sounds crazy, but when you think about it, it's very comparable to teas. And if you had a cup of tea and you were making a cup of tea, and if you use that same bag for a second cup, you will not have as strong of a flavor as you would, on that first use. So very, very critical. We use it just that one time. The other thing that you'll see down here is size, right? We have different size barrels. And so what I'll hold up here is this is a little 5-gallon barrel. When we first started 4.5 years ago, we aged everything in these little 5-gallon barrels. Loved it. Loved all the whiskey that came out of it. Was really, really great. There's a lot more surface area to volume ratio. There's a ton of wood relative to the amount of liquid in that barrel. So that extraction of those wood sugars occurs very quickly. And so we would have great whiskey, within 3 to 5 months. And we have just slowly stepped from 5-gallon barrels to 10-gallon barrels to 15-gallon barrels, 25, 30. And then what you're seeing and what I'm sitting on are these 53-gallon barrels. This is kind of the traditional whiskey barrel size that you see if you were to go to Kentucky Jim Beam of the world. They generally fill up these 53-gallon barrels. And so with the amount of liquid in here versus the wood, you generally have to age these guys for at least 2 years. You'll see, and a lot of times, you can see upwards of 20, 24-year-old whiskey. So a lot is happening, and it's very dependent on what you put into it, what sort of molecules you put into it. And then a lot of it is temperature driven. So we don't regulate the temperature down here. It's hot in the summertime, it's cold in the wintertime. And that heating and cooling creates this expansion and contraction effect that just aids in that whiskey going in and out of the wood pores. Chemical reactions are occurring differently at different temperatures. And so as it sits and mellows in this climate, that's how we have our maturation of the whiskey. And so all taste driven here. Our hardest job that we have to do is we have to test all of the whiskey barrels. And so we'll come down here, we try to keep an eye on all of the whiskey barrels. We'll crack, a few barrels, try to do it a couple a day just to keep things, keep things fresh, figure out kind of what we have aging and how it's maturing over its lifespan. And then once it reaches kind of its peak maturity, that's when we tend to bottle and barrel all of our whiskey. So I think I hit my key points. If there was any questions at this point, I certainly think this would be a good time to open it up to the floor. And Sam, if you had anything else to add that I missed, let me know.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions.
Good.
So I think you kind of hit on it, but to regulate the consistency of the taste, you guys, different barrels and then different bottles might be a little different from one another, right?
Yes, great question. So it is true, and in the end of the day, wood it's a living organism. You may have different flavors. You may have different flavors from different seasons, different growth. So really, the art of the consistency is driven by the blending. And so whenever you do it, and what other people will generally do too, is you evaluate each barrel, and then you blend to what you call a spec. So you'll say, okay, hey, this is my profile. This is what our bourbon tastes like. And then what you'll do is you'll find barrels that give you flavors of your spec. and then you try to blend them together to keep a consistent product. So what we generally say is that, we are far from perfect in keeping things exactly consistent. Our goal, though, and what we're blatantly open about, is that we will keep it between the lines. So, nothing will go into barrels that we don't deem good, that we wouldn't ourselves drink, and then we'll keep it between the lines. So if you try batch 1 today or batch 30 today, and then compare it to batch 40 a year from now, the goal is that it'll be between the lines. It'll be consistent. There may be subtle differences depending on, on the blend.
Got it. And are all older age whiskeys better than younger age whiskeys?
That's a great question. And you know what? So what I love about whiskey is it is up to the individual. And so my personal opinion is that no, I don't think age always indicates a better whiskey. And same with price too, right? Like wines, if a lot of times wine drinkers too, you don't always have to get the most expensive or the oldest, wine, and same with whiskey. It's all about finding what you prefer and what flavors you like. They will be different though. And so kind of the big thing, especially when you try some younger whiskeys like ours are about 2 years old. That's kind of our time frame right now, is where where our products are about. They're about 2 years old. They will taste slightly different than an 8 or a 10-year-old whiskey. And that may be something that you enjoy, or that may be something that, hey, I prefer maybe the heavier oaks and the heavier caramels than, say, in a younger whiskey where sometimes the grain is a little bit more pronounced, or sometimes you have more tropical fruits and lighter spice flavors. And so it's all preference, really, in the end of the day. And that's what I love doing, though, is trying, right? It's seeing what you like and seeing what flavors you enjoy, I think, is the best part about it.
And can you remind us, what kind of wood are those barrels?
Yeah, great question. So all white oak, and that is a law. It has to be a white oak, new barrel charred on the inside for you to make a American bourbon or rye whiskey.
And do you turn those barrels? You think of like a winemaker, is turning the bottles. Do you have to do that for the barrels as well?
Yeah. So we don't. And again, right, everything is subjective. Our mentality and what we find that we really like and what we do is, if you haven't figured out by now, right, we are a little bit goofy, right? We're a little bit weird here. We treat this very Zen-like. And so we don't turn barrels. We're not down here shaking barrels. We don't play music down here. We let them be, right? We let the whiskey be, let it relax, good positive energy. And the natural temperature influx, heating, cooling, is what we attribute to how our whiskey ages. And so we don't rotate them. We just let them be, and we'll taste them, right? We taste open barrels, but we don't rotate them. To us, the big thing is oxygen. So much of that reactions that are occurring inside of your whiskey barrel over those years are due to oxygen. And so what is happening is we try to have airflow through here. We keep our garage door open. We try to have them horizontal, spaced out, fans moving at all times. And the oxygen to us is the most critical thing. Less so much moving or rotating them. But a lot of people do rotate them. And the big one that you see is that Jefferson Oceans, which is a really cool product. They literally put their barrels out in a shipping container and send them out to sea. And the ups and downs of the ocean aid in that reaction. They'll say, and I concur, is that you'll taste some of the salty air from being out at sea too. So environment and how it's treated definitely make a big difference.
So are there different barrel manufacturers, and do you reuse the barrels?
Yeah, so there are a few barrel manufacturers for sure. A lot of them are in Kentucky. We've used probably 5 or 6 of them. We've settled into 2 that we really like. And so one of them is in Kentucky, and the other one is actually a newer one that opened up in West Virginia. And we've been forming a really good relationship with them, and they make great barrels. And so we reuse some of our barrels. We have a corn whiskey product that ages in used bourbon and rye barrels. We've distilled a few beers from local breweries and have put them in some of our used barrels. But generally, just the one time for our whiskey. At that point, we'll typically work with other brewers, people age beer in whiskey barrels now, winemakers, coffee shops, La Prima down in the Strip District, and a few others have aged quite a bit of coffee beans in our old whiskey barrels, which is pretty cool. And then my favorite and maybe most unique is there's a meat shop, Heritage Craft Butchers in Mariana, PA, and they actually cure hams and prosciuttos in our whiskey barrels. They'll cut the tops off, put the hams in a brine solution, and age it in their temperature regulated, humidity regulated cellar, and they'll cure hams in our old whiskey barrels. So and then people decorate them, decorate their homes with our whiskey barrels, and we'll sell them for people to make end tables and coffee tables. So they're pretty, right? And so they have a long life after just our one use. So that's a good thing.
Well, I'd love to have a whiskey and then some bourbon barrel aged prosciutto next to it.
Oh, it is a great combo. It is.
So I know we've one other stop on the tour, so I'll try to figure out the questions that are appropriate here. So what has the biggest impact on mouthfeel of a bourbon or a whiskey?
You know what? That's a great question. And I think it's often debated. My opinion and our opinion here at Liberty Pole is the cuts and also the still. So one of the big reasons that we love our pot still is that it makes a very viscous and flavorful bodied spirit. On the big tall column stills, in our opinion, they can sometimes get a little bit too sort of almost quote unquote watery or thin, and they can kind of dissipate really, really quickly. A lot of times in a super easy comparison is with a Scotch, and these guys, they tend to take these wide cuts. They have a very almost oily base from their pot stills. And I think that generally a lot of times will have an impact on mouthfeel. The other big thing that we're super adamant here is barrel entry proof. So water and whiskey will pull different flavors from the barrel. Whiskey, ethanol, will tend to pull some more tannins, harshness out of the barrel, where water tends to pull some more sugar and lighter flavors. So if you go into the barrel at a high barrel entry proof, meaning that you have more alcohol in your spirit when it's sitting in the barrel, that can tend to lead to this sort of drying whiskey. And so a lot of people will say it, and we have a very low barrel entry proof, 108 to 115 proof in the barrel, and that tends to pull some more of these wood sugars, which I think contribute to a little bit more viscous and flavorful mouthfeel.
And then what's your favorite brand of whiskey aside from Liberty Pole?
That's another good question. So it depends. We try to drink a lot of other stuff, keep your taste buds fresh. So right now, probably my new favorite distillery, I'm a big fan of these kind of new school distilleries. I love the Buffalo Traces of the world. It seems like everyone else does at this point in the Heaven Hills. But there's a brand called New Riff. They're in Kentucky, or they're in Cincinnati, just outside of Kentucky. And so they're what I call this kind of new wave, this new school of distilleries. And I think they're making their spirits a little bit different. They're slightly younger in age, but they're doing lower barrel entry proofs. And I think the whiskeys are very, very flavorful. So right now I'm on a New Riff kick. And if you see a bottle, I think they've just come to Pennsylvania. But if you're in Ohio, there's a lot of New Riff bottles out that way. So they're kind of a big, big craft distillery, but still a lot smaller than the Jim Beams of the world. So that's who I'm drinking mostly right now, aside from our stuff.
And then to turn it back to you guys, do you have any special whiskeys planned for 2021? Someone bought the spice whiskey and really liked it. So I was curious if there are any special blends, or it's just kind of trial and error. And
that's awesome.
I'll let you know offline who this gentleman is that volunteered to be a taste tester.
I love it. I love to hear that. Yeah. So we do have a couple. So today, that single barrel, we released a single barrel. This is kind of our first soiree into the single barrel. And it's really fun. We were really pumped about this one because the barrels they taste very, very different. And so to get to kind of put a barrel that is a unique expression out into the market was exciting. This was a barrel that sat really, really high. The proof went up to 123. And so that was kind of our test into the single barrel type of thing, and just wanted to see how our customer base would enjoy it. And it responded well. People seem to really like it. So we will be doing more single barrels next year for sure. And then the one that I'm really excited about is what we call a high rye bourbon. And so we always joke, we love kind of jabbing at Kentucky. It's more in fun. It's kind of that rivalry, and Kentucky makes obviously a lot of good bourbon, and Pennsylvania used to make a lot of good rye. And so a lot of times if you go and get a Kentucky rye, a lot of the distilleries in Kentucky will make a rye whiskey. But what they do is they put the bare minimum rye in it, 51% rye, and then a whole bunch of corn. And their rye whiskey drinks a lot like their Kentucky bourbons. And a couple years ago, we were all sitting around kind of talking about it, and we said, why don't we make a Pennsylvania bourbon? And so we did a couple years ago. We put into barrels. It's 51% corn, the bare minimum for it to be called a bourbon, and then a whole lot of rye. There's about 40% rye in it, and so it's a high rye bourbon, but we're going to call it a Pennsylvania bourbon. And so less flashy than some of our smoked whiskeys that we do, but I think for a lot of the whiskey fans, this will be kind of a fun one. Because right now we also do it's a wheated bourbon is our standard bourbon. So to compare a wheated bourbon and a rye bourbon and the two flavoring grains to have those side by side, that's one that I'm most excited for. And so we'll have a peated rye whiskey as well coming out, cast strength, and then the single barrel. So nothing too crazy, but at the same time, some really, really good whiskeys coming up in 2021.
And then, so how do you make the peated whiskeys?
Yeah, so the peated whiskeys, we use a smoked grain from Scotland. We buy a peated malted barley from Scotland. And that's where this peat flavor is really known to be from. And so in Scotland, you know, whenever you were making your whiskey for centuries and you needed a fuel source to malt your grain, to heat your grain, they didn't have a lot of trees. They don't have a lot of trees in Scotland, but they have these bogs of peat, these decaying plant matter that the Scottish folk for centuries, and still do, they'll take and dig up this dirt brick, this dirt peat, dry it out, and then burn it. And it's a great low temperature, slow burn. And so whenever you malt and smoke your grain over this burning peat, the smoke infuses into the barley. And so when you cook with it, that smoke rides the whole way through the distillation and fermentation and aging, and you're left with a smoky whiskey. And so if you're familiar with what's called an Isle of Scotch or a certain region of Scottish whiskeys, they're world famous for this heavily peated flavor. And so my mom is she loves peat. She calls herself a dirt eater. It's the most unflattering term, but she is a huge fan of these peated, whiskeys. And so wanted to make something that mom was going to enjoy and also be something a little bit unique. And so we take this peated barley that's typically in an all Scotch whiskey, and then cook with American grains, corn and rye, and we make these peated bourbons and peated rye whiskeys that impart this Scottish influence, but they also have this cereal American style to them. And so a couple really, really unique flavors. Peat is so polarizing, though. You either love peat or you cannot stand that smoky peat flavor. And so we love seeing the reactions. It's something that if you love it, you love it. If you hate it, it is not for you. So, but those are two of some of my favorites that we do as well.
Awesome. Well, I mean, we had some other questions, but I think I'll maybe wait till to the end for those.
Perfect. So let me go up. My battery got killed way faster than I was anticipating. So I was making sure I was on my charger so I didn't lose you guys. So I should have enough. We will go up to the front. So what we're going to do here is walk up to the front of our distillery. So what's fun about our distillery is it's meant to feel like you're in this colonial meeting house. And so it has this vibe to it that, you've walked back in time into the 1790s and you're sitting and sharing a dram of whiskey, as you would have back in the 1790s. And so we have this room that's kind of we call this our Tinker dining room. This is named after a gentleman called Tom the Tinker, who would actually shoot holes in people's stills who paid their excise tax. And so he was a very popular guy because he would discourage people from paying their excise tax. And then we'll walk up. Actually, the single barrel bottles are being shipped out right now. And so what I'll do here is let me set this guy right here. And so what you'll see behind me is a really cool tasting room. And so this is what we call our meeting house. You can see the big fireplace. The centerpiece is this portrait up here. And I think what we wanted to do is see if anybody had any guesses as to who this portrait might be. So let me see here.
So we got the poll going to ask the question.
Perfect. So, oops, this gentleman, who I'll talk about why he's upside down, but this is a great centerpiece to our distillery. Are they coming in, Sam?
They are.
Can you see it all right?
Another second here.
Cool.
All right, let me share these. We got a smart group with us today.
All right, good. They were listening. That's what I like to hear. Yes, that is Hamilton, right? So Hamilton, as the Secretary of Treasury, was not a liked individual out here. And so the reason he's upside down, though, is this was an old Scotch-Irish tradition. And so what we were talking about earlier were a lot of the folks that were out this way were Scotch-Irish. And so because they hated the British monarchy so much, they would typically hang the portraits of the British monarchs upside down. And so when Hamilton taxed their whiskey, it was said that they would hang Hamilton's portrait upside down as well. So a great conversation starter and also a very disliked individual. We actually, for a long time, we did not accept $10 bills at our distillery because Hamilton's on the face of the $10 bill. So, but we've since changed that, but all in good fun. And then the last piece that's kind of fun to see is this is our Liberty pole. So this is our big, this is a 17-foot Liberty pole. And like I said, you would see them in different sizes, right? Sometimes you would just take whatever you had and you'd make a smaller one and you hang it out. But a lot of times people, wanted to make a big statement. And so this was from a customer turned one of our good friends. He had a tree in his backyard and chopped it down and we hand hewn it. And then stained it to preserve it. But every year we'll march the Liberty pole from Main Street, the Bradford House, the Historical Museum, and then march it down and put it up every June as kind of our old symbol of our disdain for the excise tax. So, and then I guess the last piece that is very rarely pointed out on a tour, but our restrooms we actually call necessaries. And so we always point it out, and I feel even on a virtual tour, we got to point out our restrooms. And so they're based off 1790s outhouses with the beautiful wood. And so hopefully a little bit cleaner and with modern day plumbing, but
just a little cleaner.
Yes, exactly. And so, yes, but we wanted it again, right? Every aspect should feel like you're in a colonial meeting house. And so that's kind of how we did it here. So did any other questions pop up, Sam?
Yeah. So is there a degree like in wine for the work that you guys do?
You know what? So there are schools that teach it, to some degree. So we were science. My brother and I were science backgrounds, and we just the way we learned it was through trial and error. And so it's just a matter of hey, try this, see how it works and see how it tastes and tweak a little bit, try it again and set up this kind of experiments. And that's what was really great about the small barrels as well too. And so you're getting great feedback loops. You're 3 to 5 months from grain to bottle, and you can start to see how things are aging in our warehouses and what our conditions and what our environment does to a barrel. And so, we were mostly just kind of through trial and error. And then the other thing is the distilling community is very small as well too. So people are very helpful, and we have some good relationships with other distillers. And a lot of times people will help each other. And if you have questions, a lot of times you can find answers to it as well.
Great. And then is there a particular food or types of food that you guys feel pairs very well with ryes and then bourbons?
Yeah, great question. That's kind of that is something that we like to explore, something that is fun. So a lot of times red meats, cheeses, and so between either whiskey neat or a lot of times what we love to do too is make cocktails out of the whiskeys, and that opens up flavor pairings by just a whole magnitude as well. Whenever you can take the whiskey and make some really fun drinks out of it. But a lot of times, yeah, anytime you have a nice steak, I feel like that's my go-to for whiskey, maybe a little bit of ice, maybe a big ice cube or neat, and that's kind of my preference with a nice big steak.
Sounds good. Well, I'll make a last call for questions here. And then a personal one, as someone was commenting and just appreciating your passion for this, but was just curious how old you and Rob are.
Yeah, so I'm well, thank you very much too. It's hard not to love whiskey is what I always say. I think we got the best we have the best jobs in the world. So but I appreciate it. I love doing this and glad to hear that you enjoyed it as well. I'm 29. I just turned 29. My brother's 31. So I had to think about that for a second, but yeah, 29 and 31.
Well, great. So I just wanted to thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate all the time today. I mean, this was, awesome, incredibly informative. And like I said, there were a ton of comments that came through that, people appreciate the passion that you and your family have for this. So if everyone can see the screen here, if you'd like any more information on Liberty Pole, as I mentioned, they're based in Washington, PA, right downtown there. But you can see their website, their Facebook and Instagram, and I know that they post a lot of good stuff on there. And so encourage you to follow them on both. And just want to say, Kevin, thank you again. This was awesome. I really enjoyed it, and I know everyone else did too. And to everyone else out there, thank you so much for participating, taking a moment out of your day and having a little bit of fun with us. Have a wonderful evening. Stay safe, stay healthy. Happy holidays to you all, and look forward to speaking with you in 2021.
Hey, thank you so much, Sam, and thank you to everyone. And an open invite if anybody wants to come and share a dram with me. I'd be more than happy to do so. So, but appreciate the virtual opportunity to meet and say hello to all of you guys.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Have a great evening.